A great example of putting in personal safety into practice was an interaction that I had the other day. So, my son was potentially interested in joining a certain after school activity, a chug, like it's called over here. And the first question is, well, where does this chug take place? A lot of times, the rules and concepts and guiding positions of personal safety can sometimes sound theoretical, and a lot of times people have difficulty. Well, okay, lemaisa, what? What do we do practically speaking? So the first question that I asked is, where does the chug take place? The answer was, in the person's home, meaning the adult who's giving the chug, doesn't make a difference what chug it is, in his home. Okay. Second question, how many children are going to be in this chug? Third question, are there any other people home during the hours when you're going to be giving the chug? And the answer to that question was yes. But the fourth question that I asked was, is the door that you're going to have, the room where you're going to be giving the chug, is the door going to be opened? Is it going to be closed? Is it going to be locked? Is it going to be unlocked? Like, how do you usually do it? And the response was, well, it would be closed, but people can come and go. And then I asked the following question. I said, would you be okay with having a rule that the door is left open? And I explained to him where I was coming from. And he gave this kind of nervous laugh, which is understandable because unfortunately, very, very unfortunately, it seems there aren't that many people who are insisting on this type of personal safety. Now, just to give it context, personal safety does not mean I am going to guarantee that my child is never hurt. That's impossible. We don't live in a world where we control outcomes. We don't live in a world where we can even control every aspect of a situation. What we can do is mitigate risk. So it's about identifying situations that are higher risk versus lower risk. And when you identify a situation which is potentially high risk, and again, high risk, here's something which is really super important. Why did that individual give a nervous laugh? Because when I say to him, or anybody for that matter, would you be okay with leaving the door open? That will be a rule, that the door is left open while you're doing the chug in that room. And so that automatically gives a person a feeling of, what, do you suspect me of being a potential sex offender? Or some other type of, person that would do child maltreatment, etc.? And the answer to that question is obviously not. Why on earth would I suspect some random person of being a sex offender? But the fact of the matter is that in situations, particularly where it's one-on-one, and if it would have been one-on-one, I don't know if I would have agreed to that, even if it would have been door open type of thing. But maybe, yes, again, it can depend on various factors and how the questions are answered. But the general guiding rule or concept really is that when there's an adult with a child, in particular if it's only one child, so think bar mitzvah lessons, private music lessons, whatever the case may be, private tutor. So when there's someone who has a significant power differential over the child by dint of age, intelligence, physical strength, whatever that may be. So adult and child is obvious. That power differential is very obvious. So we know that situation has been utilized by people of inappropriate intent to execute their inappropriate actions. So when you have a child with someone who has a massive power differential over him or her, and in particular, if they are secluded, that is a much higher risk situation. It does not mean that you suspect this particular person. But here's the kicker. If you start thinking to yourself, well, is this someone that I can trust? Is this someone that I can't trust? Almost always, we're going to wind up making big mistakes. It's interesting. I had a talk with a particular yeshiva bacher who his family is close with my family. I'm changing the details a little bit so as not to make this obvious for people who might know me and my family who I'm talking about. So I was speaking to a certain yeshiva bacher about his experience in yeshiva Ketana, and he was really all worked up about the fact that the mashgiach of the yeshiva was really coming down very hard on his shir and imposing rules about, not going to the dormitory rooms during their break time or whatever it was. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was like very strict rules that, at least from this Bacher's perspective, had not been imposed on the year or two of shiurim above them. This was something that was unique to their class, to their shiur. And I asked him, are there any boys in particular that the mashgiach seems to be zooming in on? And he said, yeah, there's one or two that he seems to be particularly, whatever it is, taking these measures because of them. And I said, well, for all you know, obviously I don't know, but I said, for all you know, the mashgiach might have a reason that you don't know about. There are things that happen that most people do not become privy to, whether it's sexual impropriety or otherwise. There are things that happen that other people don't become, so this Bacher says, no, I know these guys, I know these guys. They would never, ever do something like that. And that's actually something that you hear quite often when people either are made to deal with allegations of sexual abuse or even substantiated sexual abuse, or when you're dealing with something like this, where you're trying to put in prevention, in particular situational prevention, say, no, this person, that's ridiculous. This person you absolutely could rely on. And the way that I often address that is really twofold. Number one, if we don't apply personal safety rules across the boards in a blanket manner, like if we would use the Gemara language, lo plug, right? If we don't apply those rules across the boards, we're gonna wind up as a society, certainly as communities, societies, families, as a group, we're gonna wind up getting it wrong really often. So we really have no choice. We have no choice but to come up with what the rules are and apply them, obviously, with seichel. And the rules won't necessarily be, like cookie cutter rules, like, okay, do this, don't do this, this is allowed, this is not allowed. I personally believe that personal safety rules and regulations need to be custom tailored to the culture of a particular family, of a particular institution, of a particular situation. But the guiding concepts, the guiding rules, meaning the meta rules, not the rules where you're applying them in practice, the meta rules, those are consistent as far as I'm concerned and as far as I understand. So those are consistent. So number one is, we don't have a choice. Of course, you don't go around just suspecting people for no reason. On the contrary, every Jew has a cheskes kashrus, innocent until proven guilty, and you, of course, assume that this person is a good, ehrlich, law-abiding citizen, as we say. Would never hurt a fly, so to speak. That's number one. Number two is that just because you might know a person in a certain context does not mean that you know everything about that person. Or put more bluntly, just because you may have a chabrusa with someone, or maybe a business partnership or co-worker or whatever, a friendship, so this person, let's say, to be a good conversationalist. This person to be maybe intelligent, has a kind, respectful way of speaking, etc., etc. And it could be that, generally speaking, that when a person overall acts in a kind, respectful manner, that's a pretty good indication that they probably, in all likelihood, are going to be kind and respectful in all domains. But the fact of the matter is that you don't know about that person's sexuality. You don't know about that person's power dynamics that are inside of his head when it comes at least to certain things. For example, anybody who has any knowledge of sadomasochism, which I'm not going to explain what that is now. If you don't know what it is and you're interested in knowing, you can look it up yourself. But anybody who has any, even a peripheral knowledge of that, there are people that in their normal day-to-day lives lead very, how should we put this, clean cut, let's call it that way. Very, very clean cut lives, and nothing untoward, nothing strange. And yet when it comes to the sexual domain, all of a sudden they can be involved in activities that to many people would seem really, let's say, aberrant. Okay, I don't want to use too strong of a word, but let's say to many people at the very least would seem aberrant, if not shocking and abhorring. So again, I'm not going to get into the details. So that's a very important thing to remember, and I think Chazal really teaches this. Because Chazal say that there are three things that you can really test the mettle of a person, the real litmus test. Koso, kiso, kasa. A person's cup, how he is when he's under the influence of alcohol, because that's when the inhibitions are down. The way he acts when his money's at stake, because that's really what, sometimes gets people pushed up against the wall, and then you see all of a sudden aspects of their personality that you never thought of before. I mean, how many people have been burned badly in some type of financial arrangement, transaction, etc., by people that they never in a million years would have ever dreamed would do that to them. And of course, there's when a person is angry, which also tends to get people to do things that they normally otherwise wouldn't do. So I think that Chazal are giving us a message. Just because you think that you know someone does not mean that you know everything about them. And I think this is for sure true when it comes to sexuality and power dynamics. Just because you may know A, B, C, D, E, F, G about a person does not mean that you know a thing about their sexuality and their internal power dynamics, in particular vis-a-vis sexuality. So some people seem to have a difficulty with this because it is nuanced, that on the one hand, you are implementing an implied potential of suspicion at the very least. Right? If you're insisting, for example, in the situation where I told this person, would you be okay with having a rule that when the chug is being done, the door has to be left open? So there's obviously an implementation on the level of lemaisa, on the level of pragmatic, practical implementation. You are implementing something that at the very least implies the potential of suspicion, or suspicion of potential. It depends exactly how you want to say that. But I don't think that this is something which should be too scary, because this type of nuance is part of life. I mean, I think this type of nuance is part of being a mature adult. For example, the Chafetz Chaim, when he talks about the halachas of Lashon Hara, someone tells you Lashon Hara, and it's something that potentially is relevant to you. Someone tells you, look, you're about to go into a business deal with so-and-so. You should know he's a crook. Stay far away from him. Says the Chafetz Chaim, the halacha is, which is obviously the Chafetz Chaim is not making it up. It comes from the Gemara, from the Rishonim, from the Paiskim. The halacha is that you should pay attention to what you're being told, and you should take every measure to protect yourself. If that means not making a business deal, don't make the business deal, or make sure that you've got proper guardrails, that you're not going to be able to get cheated, or whatever the case may be. But on the other hand, says the Chafetz Chaim, you're not in your heart allowed to believe it, because you don't have any substantiation. It was just a one-time thing that someone told you. It wasn't like, you heard it from numerous, there's no smoking gun over here, and there's no strong circumstantial evidence, and it's not coming from many different angles, etc., etc., etc. You heard it from one person. That's not enough, halachically, to be able to determine guilt. And by the way, lahavdil, as far as I'm aware, legally speaking, which is one of the reasons why the overwhelming majority of cases of allegations of sexual offenses wind up not even leading to an indictment, let alone a sentencing of any sort, because, the threshold of evidence is robust. So if there's not enough evidence, there's not going to be an indictment. That, the justice system is what it is. And, and I think that you could see lahavdil, many parallels, but coming back, the halacha clearly requires us to have that nuance. And the Chafetz Chaim goes so far as to say, you can't treat him any differently. And this is someone that you actually heard from someone, let's say you trust, let's say a neighbor of yours, a friend of yours. This is someone that you trust. You don't believe for a moment that he would be lying or making it up. And nevertheless, the halacha demands this nuance. That on the one hand, you do implement whatever safeguards are necessary, and including not doing the deal if that's the only real way to protect yourself. In order to protect yourself, you give it that weight, but at the same time, in your heart, you need to be thinking about that person who is the subject of the slander, no different than before. You have to treat him the same way, give him aliyahs in shul if you're the gabbai, whatever the case may be. Now, in certain circumstances, particularly I think when it comes to issues of sexual abuse, I don't think that it would be appropriate, for example, I'm kind of going off topic, but since I mentioned it, I think it's important to add this. I don't think that it would be appropriate. Let's say if someone who is a gabbai of a shul and gives out aliyahs, and he heard that someone in the shul is a sex offender, committed some sexual abuse offense and whatever, and there was not proper tshuva done, and proper tshuva, as I mentioned in numerous different classes that I've given over the past month or so, tshuva has to be robust. It has to be a proper tshuva. And if the victims are still hurting, proper tshuva was not done. Okay? If they're still feeling tremendous resentment, pain, and anger towards the abuser, proper tshuva was not done. If the victims weren't paid a dime, then for sure, no tshuva was done. Zero. Absolutely nothing. So, I don't think it would be appropriate for a Gabbai of a shul to say, well, I only heard this from one person, I'm just going to ignore it, and I'm going to continue treating him because my giving him an aliyah obviously doesn't create any, danger whatsoever. So, Aleph, I don't think that's appropriate, because if someone is doing that type of thing, the fact of the matter is that they might be doing it to a lot of people. And if you're giving them honors, then it might be solidifying their position. It might be strengthening them. I think that in that circumstance, my impression very strongly is that most poskim, most rabbanim would tell someone like that, you need to investigate it. This needs to be looked into deeper. And if you wind up finding more indications, then we'll have to talk about it and see how we deal with it. You can't just say, well, that's not relevant, because, if you're the one giving out the aliyahs, then you're the person who has that communal responsibility. So, but again, that's really off topic. My main point in just bringing that up was to say that this is something which is part of life. This nuance of the gray zone, where on the one hand, we are implementing these rules, again, the meta rules, and then in terms of each given situation, how to apply them practically speaking, but we're applying them across the boards, not because we start suspecting everybody. In our hearts, this person is a kosher person, this person is an ehrlich person, this person is kind and honest, respectful, etc. I don't have any suspicion whatsoever in my heart, and I'm going to treat him the same. But we have to have these rules, because that's what navigating this world requires of us. So I just wanted to share that example, because I think people a lot of times do struggle in terms of what does this look like bashetach? What does it look like lemaisa? How do you implement this? So this is a really good example, and I hope that maybe by sharing this, more people, when it comes to things like this, whether it's bar mitzvah lessons or whether it's music lessons, will start having more customer demand, because this is what's really going to make things shift. It's still, as far as I can tell, largely the Wild West, when it comes to chugim, when it comes to private ganim, when it comes to, lessons, etc., etc., etc. It's still, as far as I can tell, in my experience, and by all means, please share with me if your experience is different. If you live in a community where it's done better, if you'd like to reach out to me by email, rbsa613@gmail.com, or if you got this by WhatsApp, you can somehow find out what my WhatsApp number is. So my experience has been that we're still largely holding by the Wild West, meaning there's no oversight, there's no broad customer demand, so to speak, of having transparency and robust implementation of personal safety rules. And hopefully, that will start to change, where people, ask more questions and demand, in a respectful way, but demand as the client, as the customer, that certain protocols and rules be followed across the boards in order that our children should be as protected as they possibly can be. And then once we get to that point, b'siyata d'shmaya, that we're doing our proper ishtadlus, then we can really turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and say, okay, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we've done ours, now please you do yours. Have a great Shabbos.